Before I dive into today's video, the subject of this video is quite horrific, and I just want to give this warning before I dive into this subject. It's not an easy video to watch. Viewer discretion is advised here because some of this stuff some people may find very disturbing. When it comes to any war, atrocities are committed that are almost too difficult to talk about. Ones that will always have a dark place in our history, and one story hides in the shadows of World War II that took it a step further and is responsible for some of the most horrific war crimes in history, conducting the most horrendous, inhumane experiments on thousands of prisoners, including Chinese civilians, Russian soldiers, and even some Western prisoners of war. In the 1930s, Japan started occupying parts of China. Some had similar beliefs to that of the Nazis. They believed that they were superior than the Chinese and began to see them as less than human. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japan occupied Japanese territories in Manchuria in 1931 and took part in what is known as the Mukden Incident, which was a false flag event staged by Japanese military personnel as a pretext to invade. An explosion destroyed a section of a railway track near the city of Mukden. The Japanese who owned the railway blamed Chinese nationalists for the event and used the opportunity to retaliate and invade Manchuria. An estimated 10 to 20 million Chinese people died during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Some historians have coined the phrase of this period as the Asian Holocaust. This is what led to the formation of Unit 731 and the majority of its prisoners being Chinese citizens living in newly occupied Japanese territories. Unit 731, short for Manchu Detachment 731, was the Imperial Japanese Army's funded and backed by the Japanese government covert biological and chemical warfare research and development that engaged in lethal human experimentation on biological weapons manufacturing during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. An estimated 10,000 prisoners were experimented on, and an estimated 200 to 300,000 people were killed if you include the biological attacks. General Shiro Ishii, since the late 1920s, had the goal of turning bacteria and gas into weapons for the Imperial Japanese Army, but he required a comprehensive study, and he believed animals could not supply the usable data. This is where the idea to test on humans began to form in his mind, so he began to look at people he considered subhuman. In 1936, Unit 731 was created under the leadership of General Shiro Ishii, who was a microbiologist and army officer under the official name Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of Kutong Army, located in Pingfong, Harbin, which was occupied China. He looked at the Chinese people the same way Hitler looked at the Jewish community. Japan's control over captured Manchuria delivered research materials in the form of people who were plucked from the streets and locked into black vans known as bronchi or ravens to be carried off to the waiting prison cells of Unit 731. Most victims were ordinary Chinese citizens that were farmers, factory workers, women, and even children. The Japanese military had a large-scale plan to use biological weapons against China, the Soviet Union, and even the United States, and it appears they were willing to do anything to achieve that at any cost. Prisoners were known as logs or maruta, as they were treated as non-human test subjects. Prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases such as plague, using plague-infected fleas, anthrax, by exposing them to airborne anthrax spores, or injected with anthrax bacteria, or forced to eat contaminated food. They were also infected with cholera, which was given through the water and food laced with cholera and typhoid bacteria, smallpox, as well as thyroid fever. They were also reportedly infected with syphilis forcibly through sexual assault or injection, and they were kept in cages, cells, or chained to walls in extremely unsanitary conditions. The Mother experiment was one of the most gruesome and morally horrifying tests conducted by Unit 731. It was designed to study the transmission of diseases from mother to child, as well as to observe how long newborns could survive under extreme conditions. Pregnant women, most often Chinese civilians, Korean women, or Soviet prisoners, were deliberately infected with syphilis, plague, or thyroid fever. The women were then monitored throughout the pregnancies to see how the infection spread to the fetus. Some were vivisected, which means dissected alive before giving birth which allowed the researchers to examine the infected fetus while still inside the womb. Others were forced to give birth, and the newborns were immediately infected to observe the speed of transmission. They would also separate their infants from their mothers in adjacent cells, and they would hear their babies crying but were unable to reach them. Researchers studied maternal instincts, often watching how long mothers would continue trying to reach their babies before succumbing to complete despair. Eventually, both the mother and child were either left to die of starvation or were executed by vivisection or poison gas. In a video interview, former Unit 731 member Okawa Fukamatsu admitted to having vivisected a pregnant woman. Mothers would beg the researchers to end their lives but not their child. However, the result was always the same. Everyone was killed, and there was absolutely no exceptions to that rule. If that's not horrific enough, Unit 731 also inflicted pain and extreme conditions to study the effects in different variables. Prisoners' limbs were exposed to extreme cold until frozen solid. Different thawing effects were used, such as boiling water, beating limbs, and fire exposure. Many prisoners were also burned to death. Other prisoners were put in vacuum chambers to test how diseases reacted to low pressure environments. As the pressure drops, intestines would be forced out of the eyes, anus, and mouth. Victims were placed in gas chambers with nerve agents, cyanide, and anthrax aerosols, and scientists observed how long it would take to die and documented the symptoms. Unit 731 also studied the use of bayonets, swords, and knives with the use of their prisoners. They also studied flamethrowers on both covered and exposed skin. They also set up gas chambers to test subjects with blister agents and nerve gas. I also found in my research that there were human subjects locked up and deprived of food and water to see how long humans could survive. The effects of high G-forces on pilots and falling paratroopers were studied by loading human beings into large centrifuges and spun them at higher and higher speeds until they lost consciousness or died, which usually happened at 10 to 15 Gs. Any prisoner that somehow managed to survive these horrific experiments were killed using either potassium cyanide or chloroform. Nakawa Yanasu, who was a professor at Osaka University, studied at Kyoto University during the war. While he was there, he watched the footage of the human experiments and executions from Unit 731. He would later state, some of the experiments had nothing to do with advancing the capability of germ warfare or the medicine. There is such a thing as professional curiosity. What would happen if we did such and such? What medical purpose was served by performing and studying beheadings? None at all. They were just playing around. Professional people too like to play. And it shows the sadistic mindset and culture of these people committing these horrific acts on their victims. The New York Times interviewed a former member of Unit 731 who remained anonymous as a former Japanese medical assistant, recounting his first horrifying experience in vivisecting a live human being who had been deliberately infected with plague for the purpose of developing plague bombs for the war. He is quoted as saying, "The fellow knew that it was over for him, so he didn't struggle when they led him into the room and tied him down. But when I picked up the scalpel, that's when he began screaming. I cut him open from the chest to the stomach and he screamed terribly and his face was all twisted in agony. He made this unimaginable sound. He was screaming so horribly, but then finally he stopped. That was all in a day's work for the surgeons, but it really left an impression on me because it was my first time." Now, if you wanted to surmise Unit 731 in a few short sentences, that conveys it perfectly to a horrifying degree. Unit 731, however, didn't just experiment on prisoners, it also used biological weapons against civilians in China. Japanese aircraft dropped plague-infested fleas over Chinese villages. Plague outbreaks killed tens of thousands in Ningbo, Changdad, and Guangzhou. Wells in enemy villages were poisoned with cholera bacteria. At least 12 large-scale bioweapon field trials were carried out, and at least 11 Chinese cities attacked with biological agents. An attack on Shanad in 1941 reportedly led to the death of 10,000 biological casualties. In 1945, Japanese plan using kamikaze pilots as well as about 9,000 balloon bombs known as Fugo, carrying incendiary bombs which were launched into the jet stream during this period. More than 200 ultimately actually reached the United States. 6 people were killed in Oregon when a bomb was detonated. They also tried to drop plague-infected fleas over San Diego, California, known as Operation Cherry Blossoms, at night, and it never came to be when Japan surrendered in 1945. The Japanese also gave tainted food, candy, and clothing to civilians. Cholera and typhoid were intentionally spread in food markets. With the end of World War II and Japan's complete surrender calendar, no prisoners of Unit 731 made it out alive. Bodies were dumped in mass graves in China, some were dissolved in acid, and others were cremated in large incinerators. One of the most egregious acts post-World War II was the sheer lack of justice for the victims of the people who committed these atrocious acts. Unit 731's leader, Shiro Ishii, was never prosecuted for their crimes. The US actually granted immunity to many Japanese scientists in Unit 731 in exchange for their research data. This was part of USA's Cold War strategy to obtain Japanese biological warfare data before the Soviets. In fact, the CIA and the USA would use this data to develop their own germ warfare weapons. Most Unit 731 scientists went on to have lucrative, successful careers in medicine, academia, and business, and no one was ever held accountable for the crimes. Japan tried to erase Unit 731 from history. The Japanese government have never officially acknowledged the atrocities of Unit 731, and many Japanese textbooks either omit what happened or try to downplay it. Just before Japan surrendered in World War II, Unit 731 destroyed nearly all of its records. Ministries in Tokyo ordered the destruction of all incriminating materials, including those in Pingfang. Potential witnesses such as 300 remaining prisoners were either gassed or fed poison, while the 600 Chinese and Manchurian laborers were shot. The Japanese government were well aware of what was occurring during these experiments. In 1983, the Japanese Ministry of Education asked the Japanese historian Saburo Leng to remove a reference from one of its textbooks that stated that Unit 731 conducted experiments on thousands of Chinese. The ministry alleged that no academic research supported the claim. In 1984, Japanese historian Tsushi Kishi translated and published over 4,000 pages of US documents on Japanese biological warfare. The ministry backed down after new studies were published in Japan and important evidence started to surface in the United States. To this day, there are a lot of things we don't know about Unit 731. Historians believe there are more records from Unit 731 hidden in US and Japanese archives. The experiments carried out on the victims of Unit 731 are one of the most horrific, horrifying examples of human cruelty in our history. The sheer scale of suffering and deliberate cover-up, and it's certainly one of the darkest plights in Japanese history. Now, the Soviet Union reportedly captured several low-ranking Japanese officials and held secret trials in Khabarovsk. I'm butchering that. The Soviets uncovered a lot of hidden details about Unit 731. The trials exposed the use of anthrax, plague, and cholera on Chinese civilians and Soviet POWs. The West ignored these findings at the time, dismissing them as Soviet propaganda. Many of these officers were sentenced to 25 years of hard labor in Soviet prisons. As it stands, Sheldon Farris' Factories of Death from 1994 estimates the loss of life at 200,000, with Daniel Barenblatt's A Plague of Humanity published in 2008 putting it as high as 580,000. There are some other horrific acts committed by these researchers on the prisoners, but I do not want to share everything because it's quite horrific. The families of the prisoners have never been compensated by the Japanese government. There's been many investigations as members of Unit 731 have come forward, as well as burial sites being found, but the results are always the same: denial that they are connected to Unit 731. In 2018, the Japanese government did release thousands of names of members of Unit 731 in response to a request by Katsu Nichiyama, a professor of Shiga University of Medical Science. But that's it, guys. Thanks so much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments down below what you think. If there's anything I missed, please let me know in the comments down below. It's quite a heavy topic, and I'd want to know what you guys think. Is it something that you were aware of, or is it something like me that kind of got slipped under the rug because of so many of the atrocities that happened during World War II and after? But that's it, guys. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Peace out.